Now, once you uh, keep this matter in your mind, you will not be surprised that the standard, the Sharia standard of AAO number 21 explicitly says that you may not sell shares on the basis of salam. This is, you will find it in the standard in item in article 3 over 11. 3 over 11, that you may not sell shares on the basis of salam. You can appreciate why this is not permissible, because unlike real commodities, whose real aspect is very well defined from now until then, the shares are representing a changeable reality. And nobody knows how this reality will transpire on the date of delivery. So this is one fundamental rationale for the prohibition. Now there is another rationale for prohibition of salam in shares. Some years ago, the Islamic Development Bank invited a distinguished economist, Professor Maurice Allais, to come and give a lecture here in Jeddah. After the lecture, Maurice Allais, for your knowledge, has received the Nobel Prize in economics in the early 80s. He is a well-regarded, highly regarded French economist. Now, after the lecture, there was a question and answer period, and I remember someone. Now, Professor Allais is highly critical of financial markets and repeatedly describes several of their operations are rather similar to a casino. Now, he was asked, Professor Allais, do you want to prevent selling something like salam? They didn't use this word, but they explained to him an operation which is very similar to salam in commodities. He said, no, this is a useful activity, and I will definitely not call for its prevention. It should be lit because it helps produce more goods in the future. It helps create value. Then the same one who questioned him, he said, but you are saying you do not agree to selling shares of this company or that company on the same basis. He said, no, this is different. He said, look, the shares of a company are a fixed quantity. When you sell them on the basis of that future delivery, are you helping produce more shares of the company? Obviously not. So he said, these two operations are not the same. Selling a commodity for future delivery has a potential of creating value, of adding to goods and services in society. But selling shares of an existing company for future delivery doesn't have these advantages. So notice here, there is economic logic also behind saying that salam in shares should not be allowed. There is a third objection to applying salam to shares. It is mentioned in the standard which is in your hand. You notice that it is a good practice. The AAO at the end of the standard reviews very briefly the basis of the various rules contained, the Sharia basis of the various rules contained in the standard. In this case, you will notice in the last section giving the fiqh basis of the various rules, they are stating, let me give you the number. No. It is given in article number 14 of the appendix to the standard مستند الأحكام الشرعية. In number 14 they are giving you the basis. Now the basis they are mentioning is well known in fiqh, and it is weaker basis for objection than the 2 points I just mentioned. It is there, you read it at leisure. It may be explaining it will be too involved, but I'll give just an indication for you to understand the basis they are suggesting for preventing salam. It is different from the 2 things I just mentioned. You know, in salam, it is well known in fiqh, you cannot make the commodity being sold in salam to be the specific production of a certain production unit. That is, suppose my company produces watches. You cannot say, or no, let's take something not watches. Suppose I produce apricots, but my apricots are very special. They are not like the apricots other people in the country produce. These special apricots cannot be subject of salam. You cannot say, I am selling you 500 kilos of the apricots of Anas Darqa that is produced in his garden. No, this is not acceptable in salam. Why? Because they say the salam commodity must be available. It should not be special. It should be a common commodity which is available. So if producer X for some reason didn't produce or got a default or some problem in his production, the same commodity is available from someone else. If you specify salam from a given factory or given farm, this is not legitimate. So the Sharia standard at this point number 14 is citing this reason that you are in selling shares. Of course, you are selling shares of a specific company, and this is against the rule of salam. Even though this is true, but I find it the weakest objection. The other 2 I mentioned to you, that the reality represented by the share is continuously changing, and number 2, it lacks the economic justification for permitting salam. As I mentioned, referring to Professor Ali, you will recall in this context that all fuqaha notice that permission of salam is an exception from a wider rule in Sharia. You are not supposed to sell what you do not own. Of course, in salam, you are selling not only what you don't own, but sometimes things which do not exist yet. That is, I am selling you dates to be delivered at the end of 2009. They are not yet there in the market. They are not produced yet. So clearly, salam is an exception from a wider rule of selling what you don't have. All fiqh schools clearly say that even though, and it is related in the hadith which permits salam, that the Prophet ﷺ prohibited us from selling what we do not own, but permitted salam. So everyone recognizes it's an exception from a wider rule. The economic logic behind this exception is totally lacking in selling shares. So this is what I want to say about this matter of selling shares on the basis of salam. let me move to Arabun, sale of shares. And now, uh, again, even though the Sharia standard 21 does not refer specifically to Arabun sale as apply to shares, but we can make our own conclusion. Now, suppose I am of the view that it is permissible to sell shares on salam basis. Just suppose. I am not of this view, of course. I am against it. But suppose I am from the group who says it is permissible to sell shares on salam basis. What would be involved in selling shares on salam? I own shares of certain company. You come to me. You say, I want to buy 100 of these shares to be delivered to me 6 months from now. When you do this, you are supposed to advance me the price agreed upfront. Right now, you have to. This is agreed by all fuqaha. The salam principle, the full price, had to be advanced at the time of the contract, at the time of contracting. Now, suppose I tell you, look, you just pay me part of the price. Give me little money now, and you pay the rest later. Everybody says this is illegitimate in salam. Then I say, oh, okay, I found a way out. You don't call this contract between us, don't call it salam. Let us call it Arabun sale. You give me little money now, and you have 2 months or 6 months to think about it. If you decide to buy the shares after 6 months, you pay the remaining price. This is the Arabun sale. If you decide not to buy, I keep the Arabun. So notice, when we apply Arabun sale to shares in the form I told you, where you give the option period a long period, it's not for today or tomorrow or a couple of days, it's for several months maybe, you are breaking even the rules of salam. I mean, even if you forget all what we mentioned about salam being improper to apply to shares, in Arabun apply to shares, you are breaking further rule of not advancing the salam money all up front. Clearly, in my view, this is totally untenable, because you are breaking just too many rules. And add to it, this Arabun sale of shares is clearly a speculative activity which is a zero-sum game. As you economists must know, when you buy on the basis of such a setup, there is the shares of a particular company are there. They have, say, 100,000 or 1 million shares of company X. Unless the company changes its bylaws, the number of shares outstanding is rather fixed. It changes after long procedures. But basically it is shares outstanding of a given company which is properly licensed are generally fixed in number. So you apply Arabun sale to it, you are helping only in pure speculation on price ups and downs. And you are doing it in a way that generates no value added. It is pure speculation, zero-sum game. and I definitely think it should not be permitted. Let me move to point 1.4, borrowing and lending and rental of shares.